Ait squachel halit siamna ait jelacha. Sahanap tenet. Chasalea seneth Saanich, with Tsartlip lungs. I'm Sahanap. It's my traditional Coast Salish name. I'm from the Tsartlip village in the Saanich territory, where you are today. This is a territory that is shared among 5 villages, Malahat being the closest of the Saanich villages to where we are tonight. Tonight I'm just gonna run through a few slides here. As was pointed out, I'll be talking about Saanich. I'll introduce you a little bit more about the Saanich people, who we are, as I've learned it. The BC treaty process, and you'll understand why I'm going to talk about the treaty process as we go through. Malahat LNG, governance concerns, economic concerns, environmental concerns, summary, action, and you'll actually find that some of my actions are exactly what Laurel said. It's just very similar. Who can you talk to? So who's Adam Olsen? As I said, a member of Tsartlip, a lifelong resident of Brentwood Bay, a fisherman, someone who spent an awful lot of time just a few feet off of Bamberton, former member of Central Saanich Council, and now the former Interim-Leader of the BC Green Party. The Saanich people are made up of 5 villages, including the Malahat, Paquachin, Tsartlip, Sayout, and Saicum. We're also very closely related to, we've got relatives in Lummi, which is on the other side of the Salish Sea near Bellingham, and the communities around Lummi. I've got lots of family members that are Lummi people. Olsen comes from that side, and we are straight Salish people. If you take lines and draw it off of the top of the Saanich Peninsula and further south near Mount Doug or Cadbro Bay, there's a sort of a shared territory down there. But if you draw lines straight east, you'll identify with the straight Salish people. It includes the southern Gulf Islands and the San Juans. My family has got strong connections in Main Island, for an example, and Henry Island, which is on the San Juan side. My family, I come from reef net fishermen. The squala is what it's called. And it's an ancient form of fishing for sockeye salmon. And we were governed by the laws of the reef net fishery. We spent a lot of time in the Gulf Islands throughout the summer. And the sockeye salmon and the fishing of the sockeye salmon really ruled the straight Salish people. The Saanich Inlet chum fishery, on the other hand, was our key source of protein for the winter time, and that was the fish that we were catching. My dad and I in our boat as we were hanging out in front of Bamberton. That's where they hung out, right there. You just go back and forth all day long. If there was a GPS on me, it would just be this big blob, because we would just go back and forth and back and forth, and we'd catch springs in there as well. The Saanich people, we were fish harvesters, but the Saanich people harvested much more than just salmon, anything that you could think of. And one of the best quotes that I have, and I've got it written up here, that you hear from our elders, is that when the tide goes out, the table is set. And that's the relationship with the food sources, the seafood sources, fresh food. When the tide goes out, this is when we start to harvest our dinner. We are governed by ancient laws. We were not a lawless people. We are not a lawless people. We are governed by ancient laws. And this is really important that you understand this, because those ancient laws have never been extinguished. They are still intact today. And what we're seeing in the Saanich Inlet does not follow. It has not followed. And I've received phone calls, people calling me to tell me, Adam, what's going on in the Saanich Inlet right now does not follow the laws of the Saanich people or of the Coast Salish people. It goes against those laws. And I'll say that now because we're going to go back and we're going to talk about what kind of partner Steelhead LNG has been in the Saanich Inlet to the First Nations people. And a good partner would understand the laws, the ancient laws, and they'd work within it. We are Douglas Treaty people. 1850s, we signed treaties with the Hudson's Bay Company, who was in charge of the British and the British interests here. With James Douglas, we signed treaties that allowed us to hunt and fish as formerly, and this is a very important thing. Those treaties have never been extinguished, at least on the Saanich Peninsula side. They are in negotiation with the Tumuk Treaty process right now, but the Saanich Peninsula, the 4 communities, the 4 villages on the Saanich Peninsula have never had a discussion about the Douglas Treaty. It is still a valid treaty today. We still have the right to fish as formerly, language that scares the federal and provincial government in many, many different ways. Define as formerly. It's a problem for them, not a problem for us. The problem for us is that it's been largely ignored. Started being ignored in the 20th century when they started to see that we actually knew where to place our reef nets. They wanted those fishing locations. And so the treaty, following the signing of the treaty in the early 1900s, started to be ignored. The relationships in the Saanich territory are some of the most complex in this province. The reason is because we have these old treaties. Unlike many places, there are older treaties in northern BC, but in southern British Columbia, and for the most part in British Columbia, the territories are largely unceded. And in fact, the treaty and my sister's on Tsartlip Council, if you listen to how they talk about it, you'll understand that these were not treaties, these were not land exchanges. This was not a trade. This was a peace treaty. The treaty happened only because there were bad interactions between the settlers and the First Nations here, and these were in order to determine how we were going to share this place in terms of living alongside one another. And it was really important for our elders that for our ancestors that we retain the right to fish as formerly, because as I said earlier, it governed us. That fishery governed us. The 4 Saanich Peninsula communities are not in the BC Treaty process. Malahat is part of the Tumuk Treaty. The 4 villages on the Saanich Peninsula have been very clear that they don't want to have anything to do with the BC Treaty process, right from day one in the early 1990s when the NDP government brought it in. I believe it was the NDP government. Anyway, when the government brought it in. The BC Treaty process, and so from my opinion, the BC Treaty process extinguishes rights. We have Aboriginal rights in title. Those are being recognized now. The BC Treaty process is designed to extinguish those rights, to make and to develop a self-government which would be unique to every community that signs those treaties. I'm not against signing of treaties. I'm against having to extinguish your rights at the door before being welcomed to the table to negotiate. That is what I don't like. More than 2 decades in negotiations, there's been 4 treaties moved to implementation, or stage 6, which is the last stage. It represents 8 First Nations in this province. There's more than 200. 7 First Nations are in stage 5, including the Tumuk, which is the treaty that the Malahat are part of. Approximately half, 104 of the First Nations in the province are negotiating in some way a treaty, which means that half are not. So I'm actually just going to this is a quote from the BC Treaty website. I'm just going to pull a few facts out. The BC Treaty Commission since 1993 has allocated approximately $597 million in negotiating funds, support funding, to 50 First Nations, a third of the First Nations. $471 million is in the form of loans, and $126 million is in the form of non-repayable contributions, the stuff that the governments are willing to forget. For every $100 of negotiation support funding, $80 is a loan to the First Nation, $12 is a contribution from Canada, and $8 is a contribution from British Columbia. And what I will say is that in here it says that the reason why they're giving this money for the negotiation is to bring First Nations onto a more even footing in their negotiation. And what I argue is that, in fact, it creates a scenario within some of the most impoverished communities in our province that indebts them. It doesn't put them on a more even footing, it puts them in a worse situation. It creates a negotiation table that is so slanted, leaning towards the governments, that it's no wonder why there's only 8 communities that have a treaty at this 20 years later. Because once you get into that process, you're wondering how you can't get to the end, because you owe the government so much money, and it comes right off the top when the negotiation is set. So it creates incredible pressures within our communities, within First Nations communities, to negotiate a final agreement. And a true negotiating table, a fair negotiating table, would give the freedom of the parties at that table the ability to walk away if they're not getting what they want. The tables that have been set by the provincial and federal government, there is only one door, and it's the indoor. The outdoor, and once you get in the room, you're trapped there until you sign an agreement from the way I see it. There is no pressure on the government. None at all. They just keep reaching back into your pocket and pulling out more money, and on and on and on it goes for another decade. They don't have to pay you back. They're not paying the people of British Columbia or the people of Canada back for 20 years of negotiations with very little results. No, it just comes, we just need more money. So when you have this tripartite negotiating arrangement, and only one member of that arrangement carries debt, it's an awful situation. It's an awful situation. And I've been warned about this. I've been warned about this by folks who are in the treaty process. I need to be cautious. And I agree, I need to be cautious. I speak strongly about it. I come from a community that has been very principled in staying out of the BC treaty process. So I speak very strongly about this, but I do want to say we cannot abandon the First Nations that entered into that process. They are there. It is real. It is happening. And so it's not good enough to do what the provincial government did last spring when they said, yeah, we're just going to get rid of it. How? I don't know. We're just not going to appoint a chief commissioner. We're just not going to appoint someone who's very, very fit for the job in George Abbott. Would have made a great treaty commissioner. Even though I said what I said about it, George Abbott would have made a great treaty commissioner. He knows the file. But times have changed, right? In British Columbia, the Chilcotin decision establishing title for the first time in British Columbia has shifted the playing field, and frankly, I would be surprised if another treaty does end up getting signed, because the Aboriginal rights and title discussion, which First Nations have been following for years, has now changed significantly. Even though it's a small portion of the Chilcotin territory, it is what the Supreme Court has been saying to governments for the last 30 years with numerous treaty cases, that you guys better negotiate this. Like, truly negotiate it. Create a fair table and negotiate, because if you leave it up to the courts, you're going to start hearing things that you don't want to hear. And perhaps on both sides of that negotiating table, the First Nations and non-First Nations sides are going to hear things that they don't want to hear if you leave it up to the courts. So truly negotiate. And what have we done? We've dragged our heels around in this province and in this country, specifically in British Columbia, for 20 years. We've got a small number of treaties, and then in the spring, our Premier comes out and says the BC Treaty Commission is too slow. Well, who's to blame for that? Probably there's blame that can be spread around pretty easily, but pretty fairly across the whole negotiation. But I would say that it's probably much. I mean, First Nations would be scared to sign that treaty, the treaty. And the government, while they don't care how long it takes, they just keep going back to the taxpayer's purse and pulling money out and paying the negotiations, knowing that at some point they're going to get it back. The longer it goes, the less actually money that the First Nation makes off of it, the more they pay the negotiators. Sophie Pierre, who was the former chief commissioner before George Abbott, the outgoing one, reported that the BC government lacked initiative in negotiating treaties and instead were focusing on short-term resource development agreements. I want to be very clear because this is the reason why I've gone through this very slow to talk about the BC treaty process is because it is creating the landscape and the environment for Malahat LNG project, a project that it shouldn't happen, but it's happening now. It's happening in our community now because of what has been created here. Taking vulnerable communities and making them more vulnerable, taking desperate communities and making them more desperate. So enter Malahat LNG, with, of course, the promise of economic security, job creation, and probably it's easy money, right? The premier's all over it. There's this company that's got deep pocket investors behind it. This is easy money, or so it's being sold. And part of the problem that we're starting to see here with the result of the treaty process is that heavy industrial projects, the kind of projects that Laurel was talking about, the fossil fuel projects, are showing up in treated communities. Sarita Bay is out on the west coast where the Manalth Treaty was. Malahat LNG is where we're in the second to last stage of the treaty process, the Tamuk Treaty. Tsawwassen LNG is now being proposed in Tsawwassen, land facing the sea, I think it's called. Huge debts from negotiations, soon to be cut off from funding from senior governments, and a need to create a sustainable village economy creates, of course, the perfect storm. So on August the 20th, and you probably don't need me to go too in depth with what happened in Malahat. You may already know the chief and two councillors of Malahat stepped down in response to allegations and in coming from court proceedings. So they're left without a chief and council. They've got an acting chief. One of the remaining councillors stuck around and became an acting chief. And on August the 20th, the acting chief, Malahat staff, and Steelhead LNG announced Malahat LNG. The negotiations, we were told, were going on for 13 months before that. September the 1st, Steelhead LNG announces Island Gas Connector, still without a chief and council in place. Steelhead proceeds with announcing Island Gas Connector in partnership with Williams. The same GSX pipeline route, except instead of ending on this side, it hangs left and heads down the middle of Saanich Inlet to the terminal. September the 24th, Steelhead LNG announces a partnership with Ho and Bechtel for the pre-feed. And if the pre-feed, pardon the lingo, the pre-feed is all of the design work that needs to be done in order to get it to an environmental assessment. So the design of the facilities, the design of the pipe, the design of the routes for the carrier traffic, all that work is being done by these two quite large international LNG companies. Yet another contract signed before a chief and council was in place. National Energy, on October the 2nd, National Energy Board approves 5 export license applications by Steelhead LNG. I don't have time to go into the problems with this export license. I encourage you to go onto the Saanich Inlet Network website and check out the letter that I sent to the NEB. You'll find that we didn't know that we were having an LNG facility in our backyard until 1 year after the public comment period, the period that you should have been able to make comment, closed. So anyway, that's the National Energy Board. I could go on, that could be a whole other night, and no one would be surprised. October the 14th, Malahat announces elections for chief and council. November the 2nd, Malahat elects a new chief and council, a chief who in the campaign period was very clear about her position on Malahat LNG and was not supportive of it. But she comes on the scene and her council comes on the scene, what is that, 2.5 months after the application, or after the announcement was made, after this project If anybody's been in local government before, you know that all you have to do is utter the words, give your project a kick, get it some momentum, get it through first and second reading, and by then the decision makers are loath to go back on it because everybody spent so much money and everybody spent so much time and the neighborhood has already had so many conversations that they approve it. The goal here is to get this project some inertia, get it some momentum, get it moving. And that's what they did. So I've got some very serious concerns. I've written about this on the Saanich Inlet Network, again on the blog. I've got some very serious governance concerns that happened here. When the project was announced, there was no properly elected chief and council. The chief that worked through the negotiations had resigned. Steelhead, and I put this on Steelhead. They have deep pockets. They've got strong funding support from out east in the prairies. I put this on them. This is their decision to proceed with this. All along, they've been saying we're good with First Nations. We're building this application around a strong First Nations relationships. And as a guy that grew up on a reserve, hearing that all the time, I'm getting excited actually for good, strong First Nations partners. Just that we're equals in this. And what I'm seeing here right now is so far from that, it makes me very sad. Very sad. Because they made an announcement about a multi-billion-dollar project with no elected chief and council in place. That was their decision to proceed. It doesn't matter how much Malahat staff or whoever is encouraging them, we need to move forward. That was a corporate decision. It speaks to the corporate culture of this partner, our neighbor. It speaks to the corporate culture. And to me, it's a no-go in terms of that. They partnered with one of 5 villages. They didn't take the time to understand these complex relationships in the Saanich territory, the interfamilial connections across the Saanich Inlet. They pretended all you needed to do was talk to Malahat. They pretended that the only people that used this side of the inlet was the Malahat. They decided to proceed. They decided to sign contracts. They decided to layer agreement after agreement on top of without a chief and council in place. The question that I'll ask is, wouldn't it have been better for them? We'll get to questions after, and I'd be happy to. Wouldn't it have been better for them to wait? Elect a new chief and council. Educate them on the opportunities of the project, whether you agree with them or not, and have them on your side. Have them at every one of the events. That would have been a true partnership, in my opinion. So I'll just cruise through this because it was pointed out the economic concerns of LNG in this province. The promises that have been made are falling in on top of itself. Debt-free BC, 100,000. This is the premier back in 2013. Debt-free BC, 100,000 jobs, $100 billion prosperity fund. First plant operational in 2016. This is me. Unicorns and rainbows. Just on December the 7th, the Sydney Morning Herald, so this is Australia. They've been in LNG now for a while ahead of us. This was in there. This was one of their articles, business articles. Hanging as a dark cloud over the market for the next several years are large volumes of LNG from committed U.S. export projects that have firm sales contracts but have yet to be sold to end users. And then the big quote, the oil market is not so bad, LNG is far worse. This, I could have put a whole page here of links. I decided not to. Story after story after story talking about the LNG market and how what's going on in Saanich Inlet is just speculation. So what about local economic concerns? We've been promised that there's going to be jobs here for Malahat, for the Saanich people. They've even extended it across. You could work here too. There's going to be millions of dollars of economic benefit for you. LNG, as we're seeing in the global market, is unlikely to be developed for at least a decade in this province. And by then, hopefully, some of the ideas that Guy Dauncey, if he ever gets up here, if I shut up and sit down, we'll introduce to you. By then, hopefully those have taken, and we don't need to be using fossil fuels to power ourselves. But if Malahat LNG is approved, it will loom over our neighborhood until it goes. And then once it goes, it will loom over our neighborhoods for another 25 years. That's the length of their export license. And what I'll say is that they actually don't have to, it could be 30 years from now before they build the plant. All they have to do is go scrub the ground up a little bit, and then they've done a substantial amount of work. They'll ask an inspector to come in. They'll say, yeah, you've done a substantial amount of work. And this export license sits there, hanging over us. And so I asked the question, what is the impact on your property values? Because your real estate agents are going to have to disclose that there's this major industrial project right across the way. For people who live around the Saanich Inlet, that makes them very uncomfortable. For people who live a little bit further away, a little less uncomfortable, but still the question has to be asked. What about business investment? This is a kayaking company that I've shown up here in Brentwood. Who's going to make a decision to invest more in their kayaking company in the Saanich Inlet with that potential? And what about the immediate economic needs of the Malahat First Nation? They might be able to get a little bit of money to keep it going, but what about real economic development that actually benefits the community and not just is this potential economic opportunity for them? And there's going to be a lot more developed on this through the Saanich Inlet Network, highlighting the environmental concerns. Malahat LNG is going to do a number of environmental assessment reports that are going to have to be looked at. But as Laurel said, the amount of water, the temperature of the water, the volumes of the water, what about the air? They're going to power this thing. Other LNG projects have been forced to hook up to BC Hydro. The likelihood is, and they reported in their LNG 101, that they're going to power this by burning gas. So you burn gas to cool gas. What's going to happen to our airshed? What happens to those chum fisheries going back to the Saanich people? And the other fisheries, the cod beds that are there along the west side of the Saanich Inlet. What happens to them? What about the upstream impacts and the downstream impacts of fracking gas and then burning gas as a replacement for coal? At the same time, our government is expanding coal exports. So, in summary, the Saanich is a far more complex place than Steelhead has had you to believe. The BC Treaty process has created an impossible scenario for First Nations in the process. The serious governance concerns in Malahat that the community should have been given the space to sort out. That's an awful scenario when your chief and council resigns for anything. They should have been given the respect. They should have been given the respect to sort that out. It makes me angry when I think about it. Terrible global market for LNG, significantly damaging the economic arguments that are used to support this very project, and serious concerns about the environmental impacts, and we'll do more on this. So what can we do? Here's Laurel's page, and we didn't even talk about this today, but this is it. Stay informed. I encourage you to join the Saanich Inlet Network. I encourage you to take action. This is something that I did. Write letters. Write letters. I know that some of our MLAs in this area are going to need some encouragement, and they need that through letters to you. Because when they get letters, they can go back and they can say, look, we need to do something about this. We've got letters from our constituents. So write letters to your MLAs and to your MPs and get them to get their leadership to stand up on this issue and be accounted for. Encourage your neighbors. Here's one. Find a neighbor that you can talk to. This is the same as Laurel's. Get a sign. They're right in the back there. You can show your concern. You can show your action. Attend and host events. I'd be happy to talk about this more in smaller groups and large groups. There are those of us around that have got some that have been following this very closely, and we'd like to share this information. One final word on this. You almost thought I was done, but not quite. One final word. You'll hear these catchphrases. It's in the early stages of planning and development. That's to get you to relax and not worry. It's early. It's early on. I can tell you it goes from early on to way too late very, very quickly, and all you have to do is ask the people at Woodfibre They will tell you that in the Howe Sound. You'll hear it's absolutely crazy. It's environmentally and economically unsound. It will never happen. Malahat LNG is happening. The moment they spoke about it, it started happening. They have a desire to get this through at least an approval. Whether they have a desire to ever build it or not is a different story. They at least want an approval. That's when it has real value to them, is that approval. Bad projects are approved, and an approval means it will be hanging over us until someone decides to either sell it, move it, or build it. It's very unlikely that they'd ever say, nah, we're good, we're not going to do this anymore. That approval is expensive to get, it's got value to it, and it's very important for them. We as people who live around this, and I don't need to tell the people of Shawnigan Lake this, you're doing a great job of expressing yourself. Thank you, by the way, for that. If you disagree with me and you think that Malahat LNG is a good idea for the Saanich Inlet, take the opportunity to tell our regulatory bodies that. And I mean it. That's what a regulatory process is about. It is about getting people to express their interests and their rights. And so take the opportunity. By the way, there's only a few of you. I'll just say there's a lot of opposition to this. Make sure that you're paying attention and make sure you're taking the opportunities to take advantage of the regulatory processes. And they sneak up on you, so pay attention. Be organized, be thoughtful, be strategic, and I'm really sorry that took way longer than it should have. Thank you.